In September 1901, a man named John Schrank had a troubling dream. In this dream, he saw President William McKinley, who had just been assassinated, rise up from his coffin. McKinley then pointed his finger across the room at an eerie figure cloaked in the robes of a monk. That figure was none other than Theodore Roosevelt, who had succeeded McKinley and become the youngest president in American history. "That is my murderer," McKinley told Schrank. "Avenge my death." Almost 11 years to the day, Schrank had a second dream, one just as chilling as the first. This time, as he sat down to write a poem, McKinley tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Let not a murderer take the presidential chair. Avenge my death." Over the next several weeks, Schrank prepared to follow the order he believed he'd been given. Armed with a Colt revolver, he began to stalk Theodore Roosevelt across the country as the former president ran for an unprecedented third term in office. This was no easy feat. Roosevelt, though no longer the same young man who chased boat thieves in Dakota Territory, charged up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, or faced down rhinos during African safaris, remained as zealous and vigorous as ever. During his campaign, one newspaper approvingly described him as an electric battery of inexhaustible energy. This forced Schrank to chase Roosevelt across the country, from campaign stop to campaign stop. Roosevelt, though a Republican, had formed his own third party, the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party, and was facing down his former protege, the incumbent President William Howard Taft, as well as the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. He drew crowds wherever he went, which made it difficult for Schrank to get close enough to kill him. Undaunted, Schrank followed Roosevelt for 24 full days, from New Orleans, Louisiana, to Charleston, South Carolina, to Atlanta, Georgia, to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to Evansville, Indiana, to Indianapolis, Indiana, and to Chicago, Illinois. But at each stop, Schrank was somehow stymied. In Chattanooga, Schrank got within 10 feet of the former president, but failed to gather his nerve enough to shoot. And in Chicago, Roosevelt left by a different exit than Schrank had anticipated. But finally, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Schrank got his chance. After reading the local papers to see when and where Roosevelt would arrive, Schrank learned that his unwitting prey would get to town around 5 p.m. and would be staying at the Gilpatrick Hotel. As he later confessed, Schrank managed to gain a position near the entrance where he could shoot to kill when Roosevelt appeared. And when Roosevelt left the hotel at around 8 p.m. on October 14, 1912, to give a speech at the Milwaukee Auditorium, John Schrank was waiting. He fired at close range and his shot hit Roosevelt squarely in the chest, but Roosevelt survived. In fact, he carried right on and delivered his speech as planned. After exposing his bloodied shirt to the audience and explaining what had happened, he told the shocked crowd that it took, quote, "more than that to kill a bull moose," unquote. This is the unbelievable story of how Theodore Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt. You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Faraga.
And I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Austin Harvey.
Today, we'll be discussing the 1912 assassination attempt that couldn't take down Theodore Roosevelt, and a few other things that somehow failed to kill him. I sort of set this up a bit in the intro, but I mean, he's just a pretty cool dude in a lot of ways, and
yeah,
I thought we could start things off with just, before he survived this assassination attempt, he'd survived like a lot of other crazy stuff from like the very beginning, because when he was born, he was really like a sickly kid, and his family was very affluent.
I mean, the Roosevelts, yeah.
Roosevelts, yeah.
Right, yeah. Long legacy.
Yeah. He was born in New York City, and so whenever he had these asthma attacks, his dad would just bundle him into the family carriage and drive him around to get fresh air, to go like up north and get fresh air.
Huh, yeah.
This actually worked out in Roosevelt's favor because it gave him a lot of time to like sit and like read books and stuff, which helped develop his mind. But his father wanted him to also get physically fit, so Roosevelt threw himself into physical fitness, even when a doctor at Harvard told him that if he did things, even like running upstairs, he was going to be in trouble because he had a weak heart.
Interesting. Is that like actually sound medical advice?
To not run upstairs.
Or is that just like old-timey, that, that feels kind of outdated, where they're like, you have a weak heart, so don't exercise too much, Whereas I feel like a modern understanding of medicine would be like, well, to increase your cardiovascular health, you
That's a
should
good
do
question.
these exercises.
Yeah, maybe because he had this asthma and stuff too. He was like, don't get out of
Right.
breath too often.
Yeah, that's fair. It's just one of those things that I'm always like, I hear that every now and then when talking about stories from the past where it's like, oh, he had a weak heart, they had this, they had that. So doctors advise them never to leave their house or move.
Right,
And it's
yeah.
kind of the opposite of what modern medical advice, where it's like, oh, if you have like an arrhythmic heart pattern, like here are certain steps you can do to increase your cardiovascular health, to help the blood flow, like avoid bad behaviors like drinking alcohol because that can thin your blood, things like that. Whereas back then they'd be like, I don't know, he has a weak heart, so I guess don't
Don't
up out of
move.
your chair and drink whiskey to keep the germs away.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that like Roosevelt's dad was like, get fit, even though you have this asthma and that you're kind of a sickly kid and everything.
Yeah, very ahead of his time in that way, and probably infinitely benefited Teddy Roosevelt growing up.
He replied to the doctor, it's a very Roosevelt thing to say, but the doctor says, avoid like running upstairs and things. And Roosevelt said, I am going to do all the things you tell me not to do. If I've got to live the sort of life you have described, I don't care how short it is.
That's my president.
Yeah.
That's my president.
So that was sort of like his young life into young adulthood. Things for him kind of take a turn when he's young. He has this one like terrible night where he loses his wife in childbirth and his mother in the same night.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's some Edgar Allan Poe level of tragedy.
Yeah. There's this, you can see it on I'm sure the Teddy Roosevelt library site, but like there's this entry from his diary. He just writes, all the light has gone out of my life. Like X.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brutal. I understand, but wow.
So after that happens, he's like, I'm going to go raise cattle in Dakota Territory. And he goes and does that for a while. And there's lots of adventures there. And I'm sure that was really good for his asthma, too, actually being out of the city and in the fresh air and whatnot. We actually have an article on the site about all the things he survived. And so there's more details there. But at one point, he like chases down boat thieves and like, carts them across this like hostile terrain. It's like freezing cold and all sorts of stuff like that.
I mean, he kind of started living like a man with nothing to lose at that point.
Yeah. I mean, he did have a daughter, but he was like, yeah.
Like I said, nothing to lose.
He returns to New York. He starts to get into politics, but then the Spanish-American War breaks out. He immediately throws himself into that, and that's where he becomes really famous because he is part of this cavalry regiment called the Rough Riders, and he's in a lot of these like pretty intense battles. Most famously, the Battle of San Juan Hill, which he charges up the hill and bullets flying around him and everything, and he survives. And back in the States, he's seen as like a hero after that.
Yeah, it's crazy that of all the throughout history, people have always written folk songs about heroes and infamous conflicts and wars and things like that. Of all the people who could have written a Rough Riders anthem, DMX is like the last guy you'd expect to do it.
Did DMX write a Rough Riders anthem?
He wrote the song Rough Riders Anthem.
Wow, I
don't know if it's about Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh.
It might just be co-opting the name, but it is kind of funny.
Huh. Well, yeah. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. There were some other things. He was in a bad carriage accident at one point that killed his Secret Service agent, and he also survived a charging rhinoceros when he was on an African safari. So
wow,
he survived some stuff. But basically, what we're going to focus on today is his survival story, this assassination attempt. But I guess just to give context to that, he becomes president in 1901 after William McKinley's assassinated, which is also a really crazy story, but that can be a different podcast.
Yeah.
So he finishes McKinley's term and then he's elected to one of his own. So technically that's 2 terms, even though one of the terms was McKinley's.
Yeah. How much of McKinley's term did he finish out?
Most of it. McKinley had been elected for a second term in 1900. So he would.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So he was most of McKinley's term, his own term. And then, like, as the tradition stated, he stepped down in 1909. He could have run again because it wasn't the law of the land yet that you could only have 2 terms. That wasn't until FDR was elected 4 times. But Roosevelt decides to step down and he handpicks his successor, basically, who was William Howard Taft. But he gets really disappointed with Taft, who maybe people know is like our biggest president.
Right. Taft is the one who died in the bathtub.
No.
No, that's not.
Taft is the one associated with the bathtub. That story is probably not true. And he didn't die there. The story's like he got stuck there.
I might be mixing him up with Elvis, who died on the toilet.
Yes. He was a big guy. Taft did weigh 330 pounds during his presidency, so he was a bigger gentleman.
Yeah. I mean, especially for that time in history, people were, I think, generally thinner, malnourished, even.
Yeah, Taft was a pretty big guy. But Roosevelt, after stepping down and, letting kind of Taft come in his place, was disappointed with him. He felt like Taft was undoing his work, and he was getting a lot of pressure from the progressive wing of the party to run. Meanwhile, their friendship had also soured, and I just wrote down Roosevelt would refer to Taft as fathead, puzzlewit, and flubdub, which are all great. Flubdub especially.
Flubdub. William Taft in the tub.
William Taft in the tub. So Roosevelt decides, even though Taft is running for a second term, Roosevelt decides to run against him. So he runs as a Republican, but he doesn't get enough votes at the convention. And so he makes his own party, which is called the National Progressive Party. But it becomes known as the Bull Moose Party because Roosevelt describes himself as fit as a bull moose.
Fair.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing he would say. So it's a very contentious election in 1912 because you have Roosevelt running against Taft and then Woodrow Wilson too. And Taft supporters start saying that Roosevelt is this dangerous radical. If he's in office for a third time, he's just never going to leave. And someone who apparently kind of hears this and absorbs this is this guy named John Schrank, who is the guy who tries to kill Roosevelt. Schrank, fun fact, is the German word for cupboard. So that's what I thought about when I was writing this.
Good old John Cupboard.
But in any case, he's a German immigrant. He has schizophrenia, and he's been having these dreams that William McKinley told him that Roosevelt plotted McKinley's assassination, and that McKinley wants him, John Schrank, to avenge his death by killing Roosevelt.
Wow. Interesting that he would have more in common with somebody like Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah.
Mental health problems, that sort of thing.
I think it's more like John Hinckley, who tried to kill Reagan, something. He's not well mentally.
Right. Versus somebody like Booth, who was relatively of sound mind, but just angry.
Booth was like an egomaniac, but mentally.
Mentally.
It seems.
Yeah.
In any case, Schrank takes these dreams as the truth, and he sets out on this pretty intense quest to try to kill Roosevelt. He follows him for 24 days all around the country, from campaign stop to campaign stop to campaign stop.
Wow. My high school French teacher did that with Matchbox 20, but she wasn't trying to kill them.
That's good. She was more of not a groupie, but
She was a groupie. She was a Rob Thomas groupie,
right.
for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
I loved Rob Thomas when I was in high school.
You'd get along well with my high school French teacher.
In any case, Schrank, by October, makes his way to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And on October 14th, 1912, he finally has his chance. He knows that Roosevelt is going to leave the Gilpatrick Hotel to go give this speech. So when Roosevelt does leave the hotel at around 8 p.m., Schrank is waiting. And Roosevelt comes out. It's a big crowd, and the ex-president is standing, waving his hat. He's in an open-air car, which is sort of like the Kennedy assassination in some ways.
Right.
And Schrank leaps forward out of the crowd and shoots him pretty much point blank, 5 feet away with his revolver. And it hits Roosevelt in the chest. Roosevelt's stenographer is able to grab him and prevent him from firing again. And meanwhile, the whole crowd is turning on Schrank. They're screaming to kill him and everything. And Roosevelt, who was just shot in the chest, wants to speak to Schrank, who the crowd brings forward. Roosevelt says, "Don't hurt him, bring him here, I want to see him." And then he apparently holds Schrank's head in his hands and says, "What did you do it for?" Just
wow.
This guy just got shot in the chest.
My God.
But Schrank doesn't say anything, and Roosevelt apparently can see from the look in his eyes that he's just not all there. So he says, "What's the use? Turn him over to the police."
The decorum is palpable. That's,
yeah.
I mean, you get less decorum in modern Congress from people who aren't being shot at.
Yeah. So Roosevelt's aides kind of look. They're trying to find the bullet hole. They find one. Roosevelt reaches into his shirt and he pulls out his hand, and his fingers are covered in blood. He says, "He pinked me," which is a phrase we don't really say anymore. But
I love that, though. I love that term.
His aides want him to go to the hospital because he was just shot in the chest. But Roosevelt says, "No, I'm going to go. I want to give this speech. I want to go to the Milwaukee Auditorium and give the speech." I guess I said they searched him for bullet holes. They found one in his coat. So now they give a more thorough search and they find the bullet hole in his chest, but no exit wound. And the whole right side of Roosevelt's body is just black.
Wow.
But he still says he
wow.
wants to speak. He's taking deep breaths. He says, I don't feel any pain. I can give this speech. It's Roosevelt for you.
Yeah.
So he goes out onto stage with a Progressive Party representative who explains what had happened to the crowd, who's in like disbelief. And then Roosevelt says, it's true. And then he says, this is the most famous line, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose.
That's such a
such a line.
How he didn't win the election after this blows my mind.
I know.
Because I'd have been like,
I know, right?
I mean, hey, granted, if a rhino couldn't kill him. I don't know if a bullet will, but
right. He unbuttons his coat and he pulls back his coat and he shows the crowd that his shirt is covered in blood. And he says, I'm going to ask you to be very quiet. I'll do the best that I can. The crowd is just dumbfounded at this point, as you would be. And at this point, Roosevelt takes his speech out of his pocket. And this is the moment that he notices that it was penetrated by the bullet. His speech is 50 pages of folded paper. So the bullet went through the speech, through his coat, and through his steel-reinforced glasses case. And all these things slowed down the bullet enough that it saved his life.
Yeah, that's like a movie moment. I'm like,
It's
how many
incredible.
movies have they done that where someone has like a Bible in their pocket or whatever, right? And they pull it out and they're like, thank God I had this guy. It's like literally that happened.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny because Roosevelt was just famously a big talker. He's loved to hear himself talk. And he had this really thick speech. Of course he did. And that's what saved him.
Yeah.
So he says to the crowd, he says, fortunately, I had my manuscript. So you see, I was going to make a long speech and there is a bullet. There is where the bullet went through and it probably saved me from it going to my heart. The bullet is in me now, so I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best. Spoiler alert, he gives a very long speech. But Roosevelt also says that he's saying all this stuff they're saying about me during the campaign is why this happened. He said, it is a very natural thing that weak and vicious minds should be inflamed acts of violence by the kind of awful mendacity and abuse that have been heaped on me for the past 3 months by the papers.
It's weirdly relevant right now.
I know.
That's very, very eerie.
Yeah. So Roosevelt starts to speak. His aides are watching, hoping he won't die on stage. And he speaks for 84 minutes. At one point, he turns to an aide and asks how long he's been speaking, which is about the 45-minute mark. And he says, I'll just go on for 15 more minutes. But he goes on for 30 more minutes.
Jeez.
And as he's talking, as was his habit, he was throwing down each page of his speech. These pages had a hole in them. And the crowd was snapping up, every page.
Yeah.
And he spoke until he had no pages. He gave the entire speech. And then he saw a doctor, and they found the bullet had gone up towards his heart, and it was too risky to take out. He carried it for the rest of his life, but he telegrammed his wife and called it a trivial wound. So,
wow. I mean, yeah, I have a piece of graphite or lead in my finger from second grade, but it's not the same.
Not quite.
Caliber.
No.
But it's pretty close, so I'm pretty tough too.
Yeah, you and Roosevelt are on the same level there.
That's crazy. He just had a bullet in him.
Wow.
Wow.
He did not live much longer after this, but a couple of years.
Sure. Yeah.
Meanwhile, John Schrank is at the police station. He tells them all about his McKinley dreams, and he gives them a note that read, "Never let a third-term party emblem appear on an official ballot. I am willing to die for my country. God has called me to be his instrument. So help me God, innocent, guilty." And then in German, he wrote, "Eine feste Burg ist unsere Gott," which means a mighty fortress is our God. So this guy just, has some issues.
For sure.
He later repeats this at trial. He says he wanted to prevent Roosevelt from serving a third term, saying he didn't want to kill the citizen Roosevelt, but Theodore Roosevelt, the third termer. So that was his reasoning for it. Unsurprisingly, he's found to be insane and committed for the rest of his life. But Roosevelt didn't think he was insane. Roosevelt thought that he was not a madman at all because he had planned out this whole thing and,
right.
He had the wherewithal to stalk him across the country for almost a month.
Yeah, well, they had really weird definitions for what determined a person to be insane back then. And It's a little bit funny in retrospect, but like the grim reality is not. But the words they used, the 3 categories they used were moron, imbecile, and idiot. And I don't know if I'm getting the order of that right, but one of them was like, you're never going to have a higher intelligence than someone who's like 5 years old, 10 years old, and like 12 years old or something like that.
Oh,
and depending on which of those 3 categories you fell in, the official terminology medically was moron, imbecile, and idiot.
Wow.
And it was like, oh, you see, Tommy, we are not going to be letting you out of this hospital because, well, you're a moron.
Yeah,
like,
jeez.
Yeah, and like, obviously, insane asylums were not good places to be, but like, when you hear that term now, it's like, that's hilarious, but it's not, but like, our modern version of the word moron, you're like, that's crazy that we ever use that as like a medical term.
It is really insane. Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt, he thought that Schrank was smart enough that he didn't try to kill him in the South, where he said that he would have been lynched.
Oh, wow.
But
I mean, yeah.
the crowd in Milwaukee, like, wanted to kill him, so...
I mean, yeah, you said they were, like, screaming to have him killed.
Yeah, they were gonna, like, tear him to pieces.
Yeah. But, yeah, to speak to Roosevelt's point about saying, like, oh, I don't think he's insane. He was too smart to be insane. It shows how limited the understanding of that was. It's like, you can be both. You can be mentally unhinged and smart enough to carry out, like, a...
like assassination attempt?
Yeah, there was, like, a word I was trying to use, and it was just, I couldn't find it. Premeditated, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're like sentencing someone, there is that's important. Was this premeditated or not? And like obviously this like very much was.
Right. It wasn't just a momentary break in reality, which would be the modern version of like pleading insanity. Is like, oh, I just snapped, I blacked out.
Right, yeah.
Went crazy. But if it's like, yeah, no, you followed the guy to every state, like that's not a temporary bout of insanity.
Right. Although when I think of like assassins, like a lot of them, I mean, they planned this, even though some of them were seen, like Hinckley again, for example, had mental health issues, but he planned that out. And
yeah, not mutually exclusive.
To your earlier point, he does lose the election. He did have to cancel a lot of speeches leading up to his until the election in November, so maybe that made a difference. But it was also that he and Taft divided the Republican vote. Taft, I'm pretty sure that Taft had one of the poorest showings for an incumbent, at least ever. He got just 8 electoral votes.
Wow.
During the election, Roosevelt got 88 electoral votes, but Wilson, like, is that right? He got 435 electoral votes. So he pretty much trounced them. Is that right? That sounds like a lot. But anyway, so Wilson wins. Eugene Debs, who was the Socialist Party candidate, also wins 6% of the popular votes. So
that's fascinating, too.
There was some split stuff. Yeah. Eugene Debs is an interesting guy as well. But
yeah. Just funny to think that we could even have a Socialist Party candidate at one point in time.
I can't remember if it was this election, but during one election, Eugene Debs was like jailed during the election. And he was just like, people still voted for him.
That makes sense.
Roosevelt is pretty depressed after losing the election, but he's Roosevelt, so he kind of keeps doing some insane stuff. He goes on an expedition to chart the River of Doubt in South America with his son Kermit in 1913, just the year after, and nearly dies during this. After he returns to the U.S., World War I begins, and a bunch of his sons go to serve, including his youngest son. His name is Quentin. And in July, Quentin is shot down and killed, which is like just devastating for the Roosevelt family, especially because Roosevelt feels like this was his fault, because he expected his sons to go to war. He writes to one of Quentin's friends, "To feel that one has inspired a boy to conduct that has resulted in his death has a pretty serious side for a father." Despite this, he did want to run again in 1920. Like, that was sort of in the works.
Wow.
But he was still kind of mourning Quentin's death. He was having health problems, and then he died from a coronary embolism on January 6, 1919.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so when he was shot in 1914? 1912. So 7 years.
Yeah.
Still, with the bullet just near his heart.
And it's so interesting. This doctor at Harvard says, "Oh, you have a weak heart." You think like getting shot near the heart, if you can survive that, your heart must not be.
That's what I mean. That's why I think this doctor just doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah. In any case, after he dies, Woodrow Wilson's vice president, his name is Thomas R. Marshall, said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he'd been awake, there would have been a fight."
Man.
Which I think it's pretty apt. The way people talked back then.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's quite a story.
What an epitaph to have.
Hmm.
Like, I would put that on my gravestone. Death had to take him sleeping for if he'd been awake. There would have been a fight.
Yeah, I know. He was a really intense guy. And there are photos, of like the items in his pocket and the bullet hole and everything. It's just like, that was a close call.
Yeah, I mean, it's borderline miraculous.
It's pretty miraculous, yeah. What a thing to survive.
Yeah, my timeline of events has always been so bad in my head of American history. I thought he was president way earlier than like 1901.
Oh, yeah.
But that's just like my mental timeline just not being very good.
I feel like he seems like an earlier president, but I think probably because he's before World War I, and like everyone before then feels like from a different time, kind of. But
yeah, for sure. I mean, it was kind of just generally a different time before World War I too. Like 1900 is not the same as 1920.
No, it's so different. Yeah. And I think Roosevelt too. Like, I mean, he's been credited by some historians as like kind of like ushering in the 20th century. But it's easy to like kind of, I don't know, where do you place him? Like, he's a 19th century figure that did that. But
yeah. You got any good book recommendations about Teddy Roosevelt?
I do. I have them here. I don't know if I can pick them out of my stacks, though. There's so many about him.
Well, I'm going to have to turn to Google best books about Theodore Roosevelt. The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America by Douglas Brinkley, according to r/ask historians on Reddit.
Oh, I see it. I have a David McCullough one about Theodore Roosevelt over there.
Oh.
I think I got it for free, but it was good or readable.
Oh, is it Mornings on Horseback?
Yes, it is.
That won the 1982 National Book Award for biography.
Oh.
So
I learned from that book where Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York, and I walked to his house and like looked at it. It was exciting.
That's cool. That's fun.
Big day for me. Yeah.
I'm going to New York next weekend, so maybe I'll also go visit Teddy Roosevelt's house.
Oh, neat. Yeah, I think it's on like 23rd Street or something, but
cool.
It's also, I believe, a museum there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're looking for things to do, go to the Teddy Roosevelt Museum.
Yeah. Of all the things to do in my like 2-day trip to New York City.
Why not? One of my favorite facts about Teddy Roosevelt and Taft is like Teddy Roosevelt, he's where the teddy bear comes from.
Right.
It was based on this, like, he refused to kill a bear that was tied up, and then it sort of snowballed into like this toy and everything. So when Taft was, I'm not sure if this was before his presidency or during, but his advisors were like, what if we made a toy for Taft? Like, what if we made that happen?
The Tafty bear?
Well, someone was like, well, Taft likes to eat possums. So what if we made a possum stuffed animal? So they did. But it looks like a giant rat. And kids hated it. It was too scary.
He liked to eat possums?
Or he like had eaten one once and they were like, that's funny, let's do it. I think it was called Billy Possum, if my memory
serves. Crazy. There's a whole thing on the Library of Congress. Politics and Possum Feast. Presidents who ate opossums.
I guess that was a thing back in the day.
Apparently Teddy Roosevelt also ate opossums.
There you go.
Wow. That's just like not a thing I'd ever think to eat now.
Right. Oh, it's such a funny. Did you look at images? Some really cute ones.
Of Billy Possum?
Well, just of Taft holding a possum.
Oh, no.
Well, it's a not actually, but a drawing.
Oh, wow. I saw the stuffed animal. That thing really does look like a big rat. Which is probably why I wouldn't eat a possum.
Right. Which is fair.
Yeah.
I don't know. I could talk about this stuff. Taft like didn't even want to be president. His wife wanted him to be president and like really pushed him. All he wanted to do was be on the Supreme Court, which after his presidency, he was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, glad he got his wish.
He got his wish.
Yeah, oh wow. Taft hosted a possum feast. He said, I have had a lifetime longing to taste possum and taters.
Oh.
My visit to the South would be incomplete unless this wish is realized. Mr. Taft's wish will be gratified, and there will be possum and taters enough and to spare for the more than
Wow.
600 guests of the evening.
I wonder why we stopped eating possums.
I don't
As a
know.
country.
Apparently, it was a very southern thing, so maybe in parts of the South they still do. Let's see, health benefits. I'm so curious of eating possum.
I mean, it's like an animal. It's like it's going to be...
Possum meat is a great source of protein with around 241% of your daily value per 1 pound of meat.
Oh my God.
It also contains niacin, vitamin B6, iron, phosphorus, and selenium, and provides a high amount of vitamin B12.
I should bring this back. You know, another interesting fact about presidents and weird animals is that at one point, a supporter of Calvin Coolidge sent his family a raccoon to eat, but they decided to adopt it as a pet instead. And there's pictures of his wife holding the raccoon at the White House.
Huh. Oh, I think I've seen that picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a weird one. I think she was not a very friendly raccoon, but...
Probably not. I don't think most of them are. I mean, they're
think
pretty...
they're known for that. No,
Yeah.
they're pretty vicious. They're so cute, but
They are very cute, but they're rude
vicious.
little,
Yeah,
little
they would attack
bastards.
our cats and stuff when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Let's see. I guess our next podcast is Abraham Lincoln, but I think it's not going to be next week, but the week after next, according to the calendar.
Yes.
Because we're kind of doing this schedule now where we might do shows once every other week. We're going to give that a try.
Right. Yeah.
And this is the story, of course, of a successful assassination, but also two unsuccessful assassinations because Lincoln was killed, obviously, but those conspirators tried to kill the Secretary of State and the Vice President, and that did not happen. And I'm excited to talk about it because it's a gnarly story.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird details and I'm into that stuff.
Yeah. Well, we talked about the JFK assassination, which has a lot of conspiracy theories around it. And I think you said something along the lines of like, well, the Lincoln assassination was the first like conspiracy theory. And I was like, well, it was just a conspiracy.
It's a conspiracy.
It was just an actual conspiracy. It wasn't a theory. It was very real.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. No, that'll be very interesting to get into.
Yeah. I'm excited. I started writing the outline this afternoon. So more president stuff coming. And then I don't know what's next. I guess we have picked some subjects, but I can't remember what they are or if they're set in stone. So we'll see.
Yeah. We'll, figure it out and inform everybody.
Yeah. In the meantime, if anyone wants to get in contact with us, share presidential facts or possum facts or whatever.
Send us pictures of your possum dinners.
Yeah. If you're eating possum, we'd love to hear about that. Like, for
some
real.
recipes, suggestions.
Yeah.
That's legit. I would actually be so curious.
You can email us at podcast@allsinteresting.com, or you can leave us a voicemail at 929-526-3029.
Yeah, you can also find us on social media, on Instagram at History Uncovered Podcast, on TikTok at Real History Uncovered, and on YouTube at Uncovered History. We're constantly posting short clips from the podcast and interesting factoids and all that jazz there. Of course, you can always get more information on all of the stuff we talked about here today and a variety of other history stories. In this past week alone, I wrote about a man who was eating somebody's leg just walking down the California streets. So,
well, that's cool.
For all kinds of weird, wacky stories like that, head on over to all this. It's pretty wacky. What a crazy guy.
Yeah. Oof.
Head on over to allthat'sinteresting.com. You can also become a member there at allthat'sinteresting.com/membership. Membership, not membership. Make sure the H is in. At membership, you can get one of our collectible limited edition cups.
Mm-hmm.
And at allthat'sinteresting.com/sign up to sign up for our newsletter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And until next time.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
There you go.